I just want to introduce another distinguished guest, Dr. William Lloyd Stearman, who served in World War II as a naval officer in the 7th Amphibious Force and is a veteran of 9 assault landings in the Pacific. In 1946, he became one of the Navy's youngest ship captains, and during the Vietnam War, he directed psyops against the North Vietnamese Army. He later served as an NSC staffer during the Cold War, as a civilian in the U.S. Foreign Service, and as advisor to 4 U.S. presidents. William's father was the principal designer of the Stearman trainer aircraft, which you see right out behind you here, and the first president of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. So please welcome Dr. Stearman.
Good. I hope you can hear me all right. Okay, can you hear me? Of course, we're talking about World War II, but I want to tell you some things about World War II that I'm sure you've never heard before. If you have, please let me know. Now, this is a little bit of interference here, but now, today's June 6th, right? Today we landed in Normandy in 1944. I can't resist this date without telling you what weapon system the Germans most feared at that time. And you never read this anywhere, and I learned it by accident, that what the Germans most feared at the time of the Normandy invasion and afterwards was the 3 World War I battleships that we had off there. You probably never knew we had World War I battleships there. They were the Nevada, the Arkansas, and the Texas. And I first learned about this. I talked to a former Wehrmacht officer who was at Normandy and defended it, and he said that was the weapon system that we both dreaded and feared most of all. Later, I heard quotes from all the top German generals at that time. They all said the same thing. That was the weapon system they most feared. And even Hitler himself complained about it, because there was no protection against them. They would blow away their fortifications. They would be in formations, and suddenly there would be a big crater in the middle of the formation. Now, with an air attack, you can defend against them. You can dig in and hunker down, but you can't. You're just suddenly these shells just coming from nowhere and blow things up. And I'm sure, has anybody ever heard this before? I doubt it, because that's it. I don't know why. Well, I know why, because there was a big prejudice against the battleships and the services. And they didn't want to give them any credit. You know, I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. And now I want to, I can talk about some of my war experiences, and I will mention some of them, but having been a professor for a long time at Georgetown University, I can't resist giving you a little background information about how the war started, how we got into the war, and how it ended. Now, we did not want to get into World War. Most Americans, like 80%, 90%, did not want to get involved in the war in Europe. And I was one of them. My father, on the other hand, who had a lot of European connections, knew what was going on, thought we should have got in when the British went in against the Germans. But anyway, we were very isolationist until Pearl Harbor. That changed everything. Now, I used to shock my students at Georgetown by telling them we got into World War II because of Vietnam. They looked at me as if I'd lost my marbles. So what is now Vietnam? We let the Japanese rampage all over China and didn't do anything about it. I mean, even in the famous notorious Nanking massacre, we still didn't do anything about the Chinese. We didn't take any measures against the way But when the Japanese went into what is now Vietnam, we lowered the boom on them. We and our allies and friends embargoed shipments of oil, scrap iron, and rubber to them. And that was extremely damaging to their economy. And of course, they were getting prepared for this. So what they planned to do, and this is what we suspected they were planning to do, is to go into the Dutch East Indies where they could get all oil and rubber and all the things that they needed. Well, the Japanese knew that we would try to interdict their attempts to capture the Dutch East Indies, and so they tried to knock our fleet out, and they did a pretty good job of crippling it. And the irony of ironies is that we only got into war with Germany because Hitler, like the lunatic he was, declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. If it hadn't been for that, I have no idea how long it would have been before we would have been going to war with Germany. It would have been a long time because nobody would want to, people didn't want to go to war with Germany before. Once we had our own personal house war with Japan, there would be no sentiment at all to go to war against the Germans. But so anyway, that's how we got into, because of Hitler, we got into the war in Germany. And which was a good thing. I mean, later in retrospect, we should have gone in much earlier to help the British when they were standing alone against the Germans. And I personally feel kind of shamefaced, like I and so many others didn't want to help the British when they were really up against it and standing alone against Hitler. Now this is how we got. This is how the war began. I'd like to mention a little bit about how the war ended, some things that you might or might not have heard. When, in the middle of July of 1945, I was in the Amphibious LSM squadron. We got orders that we were going to be in the first wave, the first attack, the Japanese mainland island of Kyushu. That's the southernmost island. And so I was the gunnery officer, but I was also the communications officer because it was a small ship. So I picked up the operation plan for our ship, and I started reading, and I found out where we were going to land. And then I started reading the intelligence annex, and I got sick to my stomach because what this meant was that I had just turned 23 and I had 3.5 months to live. There was no way we could have survived that. Can everybody still hear me over this line? One thing that really turned my stomach was that they said they had 5,000 kamikaze planes. Well, we had a lot of experience in kamikazes. We lost 2 out of 6 ships in our squadron one morning to kamikazes. We almost lost me and my ship to a kamikaze. When we were going up to the Lingayen Gulf invasion, and a lone Japanese fighter came barreling down the column that we were in the big convoy that was going up to Lingayen Gulf off Luzon. He was dropping bombs on the other ships and strafing them, and then he headed right for us. He got so close we couldn't shoot at him because we would shoot up the ships behind him. We shoot up our own ships behind us. Fortunately, there were ships on both sides that shot him down just before he hit us. He was so close I could see the pilot's face. Scared? That's hardly the word for it. But anyway, it was seconds away, and it would have been all over because he was heading right for the bridge, and we would have lost his ship. So kamikazes really meant an awful lot to me, and what they could do. One thing in that connection, I'm a big supporter of having air superiority and having strong air forces, because those of us in the Pacific are the only people, Americans, that know what it's like to be in a fight when the enemy has air superiority, and they did all the time. We were constantly in situations where the Japanese had air superiority, and something like that could ruin your whole day. Anyway, getting back to the landing. When we got a whole lot. Another thing, we were landing. The area that we were landing in was abutted a cliff. Now this is insane. Whenever you make an amphibious landing, the important thing is to be able to get your troops off the beach in a hurry and into the action. Here we were facing a cliff. We didn't know until after the war what was in that cliff. And I know that an Army Major General took a look at the plan, and he saw in a contour map that we were going in against the cliff. He said, only a murderer would send ships into a beach like that. Well, that's where we were going. And then, fortunately, as I said, it was literally like being on death row. We got a last-minute reprieve from the governor when the bomb was dropped and the war ended. Now, a lot of people are troubled by the fact that we killed so many people with the atom bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We killed 178,000 Japanese. The estimates of how many Americans would have been killed in action had we carried out these landings in Japan, that's first in Kyushu in November 1st of 45, and then the following March in Honshu, where Tokyo was. The estimates for the number of Americans that we killed in action went from a low of half a million killed to 1 million killed. The Japanese government estimated they were really ready for us. I mean, they knew even when we were going to attack, where we were going to attack. They estimated, and they didn't know about the atom bomb yet because it hadn't been dropped. They estimated that about up to 20 million Japanese would have died defending against our attacks. So you just figure this out, how many. And the reason that our estimates of how high our losses were going to be was based on what we faced in Okinawa. So we knew these people were going to fight tenaciously. See, they consider this was Japanese soil now, Okinawa. It had been part of Japan since the mid-19th century. So we knew they were really going to fight tenaciously to the last person to hold the Japanese mainland. So that caused us to increase our estimates of the losses upwards. Anyway, the war ended, and I have to throw something in before I go on with this. Not long before the war ended, we captured the westernmost island in the Philippine Islands, Palawan. We got there, we discovered they'd taken 140 American prisoners of war, driven them into an underground air raid shelter, filled it with gasoline and lit it, and gunned down everybody who tried to get out. When we discovered that, we said, we're not going to take any prisoners. To hell with it. And we talk about being bitter. But anyway, as it turned out, when they finally surrendered, and one smart thing we did was to keep the emperor. When the emperor gave the word to surrender, they surrendered. The Japanese that did not get the word, fought on for years. The last Japanese to surrender was in 1974. Hadn't got the word, held out, kept going. They would have held out forever if the emperor said stop. So whenever we went out to pick up a whole bunch of Japanese prisoners, we prayed that they got the word from the emperor, because we maybe have a platoon of troops with us, and picking up a battalion of Japanese to take away to a central point. Anyway, we didn't inflict harm on these prisoners as we promised ourselves we would, but we didn't give them any food, water, or medical attention or anything. We just didn't do harm to them because we were so embittered. And there were other cases like similar. In fact, an order had gone out to kill the American prisoners. In fact, there's a film, a movie, and a book and a movie that came out about the rescue of a bunch of prisoners in Luzon. I was part of that operation there, and we rescued them because we got the word the prisoners were going to be killed. Well, let's get back to, after the war is over, we go up and occupy Japan. We went down to Kyushu, and I talked to people who'd been there. They went down to the beach that we were going to land on. Well, the first place, let me back up. They didn't have 5,000 kamikazes. They had 12,700 kamikazes. They didn't have a shortage of pilots, which we thought they might have. They had a surplus of pilots. They had also plenty of fuel and underground air raid shelters for their aircraft. So they were really fixed to take us on. Now, where we were landing, the beach that we were landing on, first let me say, we were in the first echelon. We always went in with the first assault wave. The second echelon had exactly the same load as we had and we planned to have, because they didn't think we were going to make it. They expect the first echelon that I would have been in to have been wiped out, and they would have been. Because this cliff that we were facing there was honeycombed with gun positions. They even had battleship guns in there. So that whole cliff we faced was just a mass of all kinds of artillery. And in fact, our ship probably couldn't even have made it in without getting hit with a kamikaze. If we'd have made it in, we would have been really wiped out on the beach. So I say that was, try being on death row when you're 23. The end of that war was a very, very real thing for us. Now, there's another thing. You see there's a Black Widow fire right down there. You can see it through there. Well, we were making the landing in Borneo. I was at that time with the Australian 9th Division. They were the ones who stopped Rommel at LLOYD in 1942. They were great. And we were with them, part of their 9th Division in Borneo, taking Borneo. And one evening, we came under attack by Japanese aircraft. Just one bomber after another would fly over and drop bombs, not terribly accurately, but we kept banging away at the planes one line after they came over. And then one of my gun captains said, "We're doing great. Our tracers are going right between the tail booms." And I said, "Cease fire." The Japanese didn't have anything with tail booms. It was a P-61 Black Widow. And the closest we ever came down to shooting any airplane was that plane that was standing out there, a P-61. Anyway, that is pretty much what I wanted to say about the beginning and the end of the war. but I will be happy to answer questions. My wife will come up here. My ears were damaged in Vietnam, so I don't, and age hasn't helped either, so I don't hear well. My wife has got just my ears and eyes and brains.
He'll do all the answering. I won't be the one answering.
So, incidentally, now, for those, thank you, for those who are interested in my second war, I can tell you things about the Vietnam War that you will never hear again or before. And I was involved in that war for 10 straight years from the rice paddies to the White House. So if you want to ask about what the Vietnam War is really all about, I can tell you things you will not find any except in my book, which I strongly recommend. An American Adventure, and the subtitles from early aviation through 3 wars. That's World War II, the Cold War, I was in the middle of the Cold War, and Vietnam, to the White House. And I spent a total of 17 years in the White House under 4 different presidents on the National Security Council staff. And there are all a lot of inside stories about what went on behind the scenes in the White House, all through the Cold War, and also how we unnecessarily lost Vietnam, and how we were winning it. And in the end, we won a strategic victory. Now that makes sense, counterintuitive. You won't read that or hear this anywhere except in my book. And I'll explain, if you're interested in this, why we won a strategic victory there in Vietnam.
You want to ask if there's any questions?
Yeah, you have this question time.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Talk a little bit about Vietnam. That's how we could have won that war.
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked the question about Vietnam, because this is something that first place, in the enemy launched the only major conventional attack in the spring of '72, the Easter Offensive. And that turned out to be a complete, I was caught in the middle of that. My ears are still ringing from having been under fire at that time, because I was sent over by the president to find out what was really going on the ground. And it was pretty discouraging what I saw. But it turned out that the South Vietnamese were actually defeating the enemy on the ground. And by the fall of 1972, they were on the ropes. They were just about the end, the enemy's about the end of their tether. And then Henry Kissinger, my boss, made the big mistake of falling into the negotiations trap. See, they wanted to stop the fighting for good reason, because they were losing. And they made some concessions that Henry was big on negotiating. He'd been involved in negotiating with them for a long time. So they made concessions that he'd been trying to get for years, and he was snagged into negotiations. Once we got into negotiations, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for pursuing the war. And also we were forcing the South Vietnamese to make concessions which they shouldn't have had to make. So that's, and then because there was a loss of support here, we drastically reduced our aid to the South Vietnamese, and to a fraction of what it was before, cut them off into pockets. Meanwhile, the enemy was getting plenty of aid from their allies, the Soviets and the Chinese. So not only did we greatly decrease the rate, but in the 4th of June, 1973, Congress forbade any U.S. military operations in Indochina, and that was the death blow to the Vietnamese. I mean, we couldn't do anything to enforce. We had a peace agreement, and it came into effect in January '73, which the enemy violated massively, constantly. So anyway, we we literally, and there's no exaggeration, snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. We all forget why we went into Vietnam in the first place. President Eisenhower, in 1954, said that if Vietnam falls to the communists, then all of Southeast Asian countries will fall to communism like dominoes, the domino theory, and everybody poo-pooed it. But I'll tell you who believed it. All of the leaders of Southeast Asian countries, including India, and all the communist leaders, they believed in it. And there are quotes to that effect that if they could win it in South Vietnam, then it was going to spread, quote, the revolution was going to spread throughout all of Southeast Asia. And we later found out that when there was the communists were about to take over Indonesia, in October of '65, that the reason that the Indonesian non-communists were emboldened to resist them is the fact that we had introduced troops into Vietnam in March of '64, and that encouraged them and stiffened their backbone, so they resisted the communist takeover. Now, if the communists would have taken over Indonesia, which they came very, very close to doing, that would have spread communism throughout that whole part of Asia, and it would have affected the Philippines, because we have a treaty with the Philippines that when they attacked the Philippines, which we were bound to do, then we were treaty bound to go to the defense of the Philippines, and that was against really very heavy odds at that time. So, but no further dominoes fell. I mean, certainly Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, but no other Southeast Asian fell to communism. There were other cases similar to the one I just said of where our involvement emboldened resistance to the communists. So what we went in to accomplish was to prevent the falling of dominoes throughout Southeast Asia, and we did. Think about it. No other dominoes fell except up in one of the reasons for that is that the Vietnamese communists in North Vietnam had 1 million killed in action. That one offensive in 1972, they had 100,000 killed in action. That one offensive, that's twice as many as we had killed in action in the entire war. So they were really in very, very bad shape. They were, as I say, on the ropes. So they were weakened for a long, long time. They were not able to really do very much outside of Indochina. And meanwhile, we had bought time for all these other Southeast Asian countries to strengthen the regimes, build up their military. So they were in positions to resist anything. So that's something you'll only find in my book, but it's documented. And you know, I'm not talking about things that I read of it. I'm talking about things I lived through and involved in the actual decision-making process at the White House level. So, but anyway, it's available on Amazon, right. Naval Institute Press, and American Adventure.
Oh, here's another question.
Oh, another question? Oh, yes, sir.
How many Philippine campaigns were you involved?
How many?
My father was involved in like 14 campaigns in Philippine Islands.
How many Philippine campaigns were you involved with?
I was in 9 assault landings, well, about 7 assault landings in the Philippines and 2 in Borneo. The main one was Lingayen Gulf. Lingayen Gulf was the Normandy of the Pacific War. It was the biggest amphibious, and then of course Luzon was the biggest, what am I trying to say, objective that we had. Now, unlike Normandy, most of that landing was a piece of cake, except for one beat the left flank, White 2. Guess where we landed? Good old White 2. And it was, we were really lucky to get out of it. I just have to tell you one thing, you know, on that subject. After we dropped our combat load, at first we go in the first assault wave with 6 Sherman tanks and infantry, and we get those people ashore, and because we were the most maneuverable of all of the amphibious ships, we would go back and then pick up high priority loads to bring back for those troops. We came back after that first landing, loaded up with 300 tons of gasoline and ammunition, and then headed back in. We were pelted with mortars and shells. We're dropping all around, splashes up all around here and there. We were strafed. If anything would have hit that ship, we'd have been scattered all over the landscape. There wouldn't have been enough of any of us to have buried us. So that was really one of the heritable. Well, I got to tell you something then about war in general. First place, you probably noticed that combat veterans will only usually just talk about their experiences, except when they get to be my age, garrulous age, with other combat veterans. I've noticed this in veterans all the way from the Civil War on up. And one thing, you never admitted that you were afraid. And I thought, you know, I was really pretty scared at the time. And I said, maybe I'm one of the great cowards of World War II. After the war, I found out everybody was afraid. Now, in my cardiac rehab class, there are 4 of us combat veterans from World War II. And I asked one of them who was captured in the Battle of the Bulge and spent in German prison and almost starved to death. He's a really good-natured chap, and I said, John, were you scared? He said, I was concerned. Another one was also captured later. I said, Alex, were you scared? He said, no, I was terrified. So it turns out, you know, everybody's scared, nobody admits it, nobody knew about it until we talked about others who were. And one of the reasons why we only discuss these things with fellow vets, war is so bizarre, so surreal, that you can't really know what it's like if you haven't been in it. It's just something totally, literally out of this world. And so that's the reason that you'll find that old vets, you know what, they won't understand they can't understand what I'm talking about. But as I said, when you get to be at the garrulous age, then you tell everybody to the point of utter boredom, all the things you've been through. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good night.